Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Sheikhna. Thank you for joining me for another discussion
Wa
on
alaikum assalam.
Back to Basics.
Thank you for having me back on.
It's a pleasure. In this episode, and it'll probably take 2 or 3 episodes to cover, I wanted to discuss a book I came across recently called A Manual for Creating Atheists. Within this book, they discuss training or encouraging people to become street epistemologists. Now, could you clarify what this notion is and whether us as Muslims should be engaging with these, I'd say atheists, just to clarify what they are. What is the significance of this movement? Is there any danger to us? And how should we tackle it?
Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you for having me back on. The famous book, A Manual for Creating Atheists by Peter Boghossian. It's an interesting work. And just to give the viewers a context to that book, because one thing we wish to do on this podcast to a limited degree is cover some of the areas of contemporary culture which would affect us as a community and indeed the global community when it comes to the diversity of religious beliefs and what have you. Peter Boghossian is an interesting chap who, if we were to look at the first decade of the 21st century, and it's been called by popular culture the noughties, but I don't particularly like that term, but it sounds better than saying the 2000s, right? Yeah. So that decade from 2000 until 2010, what we witnessed in the States, in Western Europe, was a rise of what we call the New Atheism. A New Atheism premised upon popular scientific works written by popular scientists like Richard Dawkins,
one of the most
Sam
famous.
Harris, Daniel Dennett, and of course propagated and given an interesting rhetorical spin by great journalists such as Christopher Hitchens. Now, such movements gained mass popularity through movements such as what we call reason rallies, where they would do these, in the same way that you used to have Bible conventions back in the day, you had the opposite thing now where atheists would start to come out of the rabbit holes. Now, of course, I have to be fair, because we as Shias, given that we understand being a persecuted minority, we want to try and understand others who are likewise a persecuted minority. There was one point where atheists within North America were really considered to be the scummiest people on earth. And really, they were given a very rough time. In fact, if you look into the former leader of the American atheist movement, her name was Madeline Murray O'Hare. She was considered America's most hated woman, and when she was eventually kidnapped and murdered in a very brutal fashion, due to the fact that she had, I don't want to use that word, angered so many politicians who were religious, they took claims about her disappearance and concerns about her death with a massive pinch of salt and not too seriously. So we do see that, unfortunately, atheists have a very rough time at times. But the noughties, or that period between 2000 to 2010, marked a new period of growth for the new atheist movement, where they were given this relative freedom. They now had these popular televangelists and great minds behind them. And it was seen as the new fad. Particularly a lot of people working within the realm of the physical sciences, that's chemistry, biology, and physics, also started to go down that route. There's several reasons for this. Number one, unfortunately, religion has had a tendency to go through very shallow movements. And what I mean by shallow movements is, Baba, you studied fiqh. There's no need for you to discuss evolution or science. Like, we can leave this to people who are scientists. And unfortunately, there is a tendency where sometimes members of the clergy, and I will remind the dear viewers that I am a Hausa graduate, so if I'm attacking anyone right now, I'm attacking people like myself. We see that certain members of the clergy choose to comment on things which are unfortunately out with their domain
Yeah.
of study. And so the same thing is true of the Christian world, where people would say that the Bible says it, God created this universe 6,000 years ago, therefore it's only 6,000 years old, dinosaurs on Noah's Ark and what have you. Scientific confusion. Now when the person goes to university, they study and they realize that's a load of garbage,
Trash.
for lack of better words. So what happens is this movement becomes quite popular, and I'm sorry, I know you asked me a question about this book and street epistemology, but we need to give this context in order for the viewer to understand. So what happens is you have this movement of new atheism. This movement's popular until the period of about the death of Christopher Hitchens. You start seeing a bit of a pushback. Why do we see that pushback? Because we see when people become hardcore naturalists, meaning is stripped away from their narrative. You don't want to look at the world from purely physical eyes. I don't want to understand beautiful sights by looking at the breakdown of the atoms and the bosons that they're composed of. Rather, I want to have a connection with the world around me. And so we see that there becomes a rise again of people going back to religion. Of course, they go back to religion in ways that they were not religious before. Instead of becoming Protestant, they would become Eastern Orthodox. Instead of becoming biblical fundamentalists, they would become Roman Catholics. Why? Because these are interpretations of religion which are slightly more open-minded. And so as a means to counter that, this chap, Bogozian, chooses to come out and deal with this problem by trying to eradicate the last group of religious people. So how does he do so? He comes forward with this manual, how to create an atheist, using a movement known as street epistemology. Street epistemology is a very apt term. I like to engage with the name because I don't really believe that people from the street should be doing epistemology. I think that epistemology should be left to people that have actually studied the field, but it's very nice to see that the atheists are trying to engage with rational sciences now and then.
But doesn't that show that their beliefs are so simplistic that anyone can apply it to their daily lives and argue it?
We shall see that, because you see, what I want to do in the duration of this show or the next show or however many shows it takes us to deal with this phenomenon is take a look at the challenges put forward by street epistemology and see, are they really as smart as they think they are? Because sometimes you see it's a common phenomenon in this world, and I don't want to restrict it to the new age atheists, not by any means. I remember seeing it one time when one of my friends, who's actually a Shia, he got hold of a book by Ahmed Didat, who's one of these old Muslims that used to be known for like quoting the Bible.
Yeah.
And the way he felt so empowered with his little booklet, he would go to all the Christians and be like, I challenge you. And you're just thinking to yourself, Baba, like, you got hold of a little booklet. This booklet has got some interesting persuasive rhetoric in it. It's taken some Bible quotes, largely out of context sometimes. But to be honest with you, if you just met with an intelligent Christian, they might be able to give you a decent and thorough rebuttal. And so I think that the new street epistemologist movement is very much the same thing. Now, where does the term street epistemology come from? Of course, everyone knows what the word street means. Epistemology meaning a theory of knowledge. Theory of knowledge how? Theory of knowledge, namely, how do we know what we know? And what are the sources of valid knowledge? So that's where the title comes from. As for whether or not it's dangerous for Muslims to engage with street epistemology, I would say that it's dangerous for a Muslim who hasn't really thought about his belief system to think that he can engage with something like street epistemology or any other epistemology without getting slightly baffled. But the whole point of this Back to Basics podcast is to get Muslims thinking about their epistemology in the first place. So I'm advocating that if you're a Muslim who understands what you believe, who has a basis to what you believe, then you should be fine. If you're any individual who has a tendency to be boiled over, won over, and quite frankly confused by intellectual jargon and sophistry and rhetoric, then of course you're going to get confused by the street epistemology. But I think that one of the things that the graduates of Hausa need to do is to come forward and, to a certain degree, show that these challenges are not all that they're made to be. And so for that reason, I'm more than willing to engage with some of the things put forward by street epistemologists to see where we get and what kind of conversation and dialogue we could have.
When you mentioned boiled over, that reminded me of a quote from the book where they discussed using the hard-boiled approach, whereby they wanted to give the cold hard truth no matter who was there and no matter how it's taken in terms of atheism.
Yes.
Now, do you feel like, let's put the layman aside, but let's discuss the Hausa graduates. Do you think we're victims of avoiding the hard-boiled truth? Do you think we tend to sugarcoat things and make it seem all cute when in reality there's a darker truth that we don't bring out?
I'm going to be very frank here, and what I say might offend some people. But I believe that what I will say will resonate with many of the viewers, and I believe that many of them will recognize a kernel of truth in what I'm saying. There has been a tendency in the past for us to have this intellectual arrogance. Dare I say that we can understand it historically and sociologically, because if the Shias were a persecuted minority in quite violent and quite aggressive places where they were never able to preach openly, it makes sense that they focus on self-preservation as a movement. But unfortunately, coming to the West, where we do have this freedom, I have noticed that there's this tendency of when I say that, like, you might go up to your resident Maulana or your resident Imam and say something like, look, these guys have done a show about Shiism on YouTube or on TV, and how do we respond to this? I understand that not everyone's confrontational, not everybody wants to have to deal with attacking other religions. But when the Mu'ammam tells you, for example, that, well, you know, who are these people to even engage with us? It shows that there's a degree of running away. And I do think that when Shubahat come out, the Ahlul Bayt were always quite keen and clear that either the Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam themselves would go and respond, or number two, they would send beautiful individuals from their companions like Hisham ibn al-Hakam or Mu'min Ataq to go and respond to these Shubahat. And so I do think that we're more than capable of dealing with this hard-boiled approach, but unfortunately we've been running from it for a little while.
Absolutely. I don't know if you want to start off by tackling one of the first arguments that the atheists do hold, but one thing that's been resonating in my mind is the way they define faith. They see it as a belief without evidence. It's just another way for us to say that we don't really know, but we're just going to go along with it anyway. How would we argue this back towards the atheists?
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. One of the things that I think that we really need to look into when looking at any religious debate is the fact that there's a tendency for both sides to kind of strawman one another. And what I mean by strawman is, a strawman's a fallacy, and it's been appropriately named strawman. Why? Say, for example, you were to argue with me that smoking's bad for you, and that gradually smoking would kill. And my response to you would be, well, Steve over there has just smoked a cigarette and he's not dead yet, so your argument's stupid, it clearly doesn't kill. You would retort by saying that, well, I never argued it's going to kill him straight away, I argued it would gradually kill him.
Yeah.
So what that person has just done is strawman your argument. Why? Because he's created a caricature of your argument that isn't actually your argument in order to knock it down. Why? Because knocking down a straw man is far easier than knocking down a real man. One of the things I find with atheist and theistic debates is this concept of straw manning on both sides. when it comes to the definition of faith in the average dictionary, in the average book written by church councils, this definition of faith being to merely close your eyes and walk across, trusting the path, it's very unique, as in very few people hold it. Most people believe that to have faith is to have confidence in something that you can't see yet know to be true. So number one, I do think that the argument against the definition of faith is fallacious. But number two, let's go with the actual definition that they've provided. Can you just provide it for me one more time, and we'll roll with it and see what we come up with.
It's pretending that they just said it's either a belief without evidence or pretending to know things that we don't really know.
Okay.
Yeah.
See, this would fall back in epistemology to what we call the problem of criteria, which is that might sound particularly great, but let me ask a question here. Can you prove to me that you're not a brain in a jar of chemicals which was created 5 minutes ago and has memories simulated into it by a computer?
Probably not.
Okay. The fact that you don't have evidence for that, does
Yeah.
that now mean that you can't claim to know you're not a brain in a vat?
Yeah, so I can claim a lot of things and not have the evidence for them. Yeah.
That's really, I don't think any atheist is able to prove to me right now with clear-cut physical proof that we're not solipsists. And solipsism is, of course, this theory that the mind exists by itself and everything around it is just a simulated illusion. And yet the fact that they can't prove to us that we're not solipsists doesn't mean that them thinking we're not solipsists isn't a valid theory. I can't, for example, prove that I'm not in a coma right now and not living out my life in the dream world. But the fact I can't prove it doesn't mean that I don't know I'm not in a coma. I know quite practically that I'm not in a coma, and I know that the world around me is real. I know it as well as I can know anything else. And so these very definitions that they give are extremely problematic.
But the probabilities are endless with these arguments. You can claim to be a lot of things and explain the origins of the universe in a lot of ways without any true evidence. So is evidence a criteria for these arguments?
Evidence is definitely a criteria, but we need to define what is evidence in the first place. So we need to look at what is plausibly evidence. Again, remember I mentioned the other, I believe in season 1, the arguments of C.S. Lewis, who said that if everything is merely the product of physical, chaotic eruptions which brought us into being, then my mind is a product of chaos. If my mind is a product of chaos, then how can I trust it to actually know anything? Now, I know that some people would say here that what I'm doing is playing the game of the doubter. But what I'm actually saying is that no, we must deal with certain key core realities that we see in front of us. I see that there's a physical world. I see that I have experiences. I see that I have memories. I see there are others around me. Yes, it could all be a delusion on a theoretical level. But am I going to deal with it in that way? No. What I'm going to do now is, taking that reality in front of me, ask the question, which worldview best accounts for the phenomenon around me? I'm not going to start from a position of zero and say, well, maybe I'm a brain in a vat. Maybe I'm secretly still just a sperm floating around in a jar where memories are simulated into my mind. Because to come up with a plethora of an infinity of different theories would be absurd. So what Peter Boghossian and other individuals like this who have come up with a street epistemology need to understand is we're going to deal with a reality according to what is on offer. We're not going to come up with a worldview from scratch.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, again, we are short on time, so inshallah we'll cover this in the next episode.
Inshallah.
A continuation
Inshallah.
of street epistemology. Thank you very much for your time, Sheikh.
No problem at all.
Thank you.